Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Institute for Government on another crisp January evening. We're here to discuss effective government with David Laws, who's one of the most senior Liberal Democrats and also Minister of State in the Department for Education and also in the Cabinet Office, where he has a cross-cutting policy brief and a cross-departmental role working on the coalition agreement. In the autumn of last year, the Institute published its programme for effective government and took that to all three party conferences with the aim of provoking a debate about how government needs to work differently if whoever's elected in 2015 is actually going to deliver on the promises that they make in the period we're clearly entering now, where promises are made. We held events at the conferences and are now taking the debates forward with representatives of all three parties. So this is the second of three events. The first we heard from John Cruddas, who's one of Labour's most influential policy thinkers, and you can recap on that if you want to go to the website. This is the second, and though we hear from Oliver Letwin and Francis Maude frequently, we will also have another event from a Conservative thinker on this later in the year, so do watch out for that one. The reason for this flurry of activity is pretty simple, of course, because it's that effective government matters, and we want people to be focusing on the question of how you get things done in government as well as what you try and do. And it's also important because that's really actually what the voters want. So I draw your attention to some of the polling in the back of our document, if you're lucky enough to have picked up a copy. The thing to watch out for, I think, is the stats here on what politicians, that the public say they want politicians to do and what they think politicians prioritise at the moment.
It's all wrong.
I mean, you've got to be careful about the public and polls because they will tell you one thing and then sometimes act differently. But broadly speaking, we want politicians who are focused on the long term, delivering value for money for their taxpayers, and what they believe they see in politics today is too much political point scoring and short-termism. So if that doesn't provide a burning platform for our politicians, I don't know what does. I, for one, am hugely looking forward to hearing what David has to say. A couple of things of housekeeping before I introduce David properly. First, this is a public event. It's held on the record. It's being recorded. It's also on social media. So if you want to join that social media online debate, please log into our Wi-Fi details there. We've got IFG guest, username IFG, password visitor. The hashtag is EffectiveGov, and to follow the IFG events Twitter handle, go to @IFGEvents. After David's 25-minute speech, there'll be plenty of time for questions, so watch out for the roving mics, which will be presented to you by Lauren and Candice, who are currently outside the room, making sure that latecomers get to go into the overflow room. If you're in the overflow room, don't worry, you will also get a chance to ask questions. Just come to this door, where you'll be handed a mic, and then you can ask the questions from there, where everyone can see you. In terms of introduction, I'm sure that David does need very little, but I'm going to give some anyway. Following a successful career in banking, he quickly became a very highly influential figure within the Liberal Democrats, initially becoming a party economics advisor and then becoming the party's director of policy in 1997. In 2001, he was elected to Parliament to the seat of Yeovil in Somerset, where he still serves, and in 2010, he was not only a central figure within the negotiations that led to the formation of this coalition government, but somehow managed to produce a book called The 22 Days in May. David has served both at the centre of government in his current Cabinet Office role and as Chief Secretary and in departmental roles now as Minister of State for Education, so I can think of no one better to take on this topic. David, over to you.
Tom, thank you very much indeed, and thanks to Peter for giving me this opportunity today to talk on the subject of effective government beyond 2015. And I'd also like to congratulate you, Peter, and your colleagues here on the Institute, in the Institute for Government, for the fine work that you've done over the last 6 or 7 years and for the reputation that you've built up in what I think is a very short period of time for leading the debate in this country about ways of improving effective government, and also, as I understand it, for doing a lot of very direct and hands-on work with senior civil servants and even some government ministers to improve their performance in government, although hopefully all of that work is covered by the Official Secrets Act or something similar, so that your experiences with those individuals is not subject to wider scrutiny. Last year, as you mentioned in your introduction, you published a report entitled A Programme for Effective Government, What the Party Manifestos Must Address in 2015. and you've asked me today to touch upon and address some of the conclusions in that report. You've given me, I should say, at the beginning of this, and politicians don't normally make complaints of this type because we enjoy having a wide remit so that we can pick out anything we want to talk about. But you have given me a very dangerously wide remit covering the key challenges and priorities for the next government, the changes needed in government to meet those challenges, responding to the recommendations in your report, 20 or 30 in total, I think, commenting upon coalition working and commenting upon the process of manifesto preparation. And I hope you recognise that to do justice to all of those subjects would probably take a programme of 5 or 6 lectures of about 2 hours in length for each one. And you've given me about 20 minutes. So I'm going to have to compress what I say and focus in particular on some of the areas that I think are more important as we look beyond 2015. So in the 20 minutes or so that I've got, I wanted to pick up and comment upon 3 sections in particular of the report. Firstly, I want to start with some reflections on what I think everybody would agree is the main challenge of the next Parliament, which is to complete the process of restoring the UK's economic position and to do so while advancing rather than retarding our social goals. Secondly, I want to reflect briefly on any lessons from the last few years about how to make government in the UK more effective. And then finally, I want to consider what might be learned about the processes of coalition formation and coalition management from the experience since May 2010. But I'm going to start by considering the main policy challenge of the next Parliament, which is tackling the deficit and achieving strong and sustainable growth. And this is not, of course, to say that this is the only challenge of the next Parliament, far from it. In our own pre-manifesto, which we've already published as a party back in September, we highlight some of those big challenges. Political reform, including the whole future of the United Kingdom and our relationship with the European Union, both of which I suspect will be centre stage in the next Parliament, whatever the outcome of the election. The reform of our public services, the protection of civil liberties, a live subject of debate as we've seen just in the last few days, promoting the green agenda, something very important to my party, and a whole series of other issues which many of you will be aware of and which will spring instantly to mind. But it's not sensible to take on such a range of big policy issues in a 20-minute speech, so I really want to focus on the economic and social challenge that we face in the next Parliament and how to handle the process of fiscal consolidation. And it's worth starting by saying that the UK still has, in spite of the progress that we've made since May 2010, a sizable fiscal deficit, one of the largest amongst the major developed economies. And that's despite the fact that the recovery in our country has been in place now for a number of years. And in the view of my party, it makes sense to set out a very clear timescale to clear this deficit. We've therefore committed to stick with the government's existing fiscal target to balance the cyclically adjusted current budget by 2017-2018. And we also intend to get debt as a share of GDP on a clear downward path so that it reaches sustainable levels by around the middle of the next decade. Clearing the deficit and reducing debt as a share of GDP is important because it avoids mortgaging our future as a country and putting a large burden of debt on the younger generation. And it also puts the economy in a stronger and more manageable position for future economic downturns. Of course, how this fiscal consolidation is managed is extremely important, and there are clearly big differences between the parties. Fiscal consolidation is not our only economic and social objective. We also, as a party and hopefully as a country, want to invest in upgrading our economic infrastructure. We want to dramatically improve our outcomes in education, and we want to reduce the unacceptable levels of inequality in this country, including of employment opportunities. And all of those things will have public spending implications. And as you recommend in your report, parties, in our view, need to be open with the public about not only their objectives, but how they propose to achieve these objectives. This is necessary for voters to make informed choices in the coming general election, and it will be important if we're to secure public support for some of the tough decisions which will need taking in the next Parliament. And I think we need to bear in mind that we've already had a lot of tough decisions since May 2010. Mostly the public has been willing to accept those tough decisions because they've understood the economic challenges that we face in this country and abroad. But the longer a period you go on having to take those tough decisions, the more difficult it could become to maintain a public consensus, particularly if people don't feel that the parties have set out in an honest and transparent way the direction of travel on some of these key issues before the election. Of course, it isn't realistic to think that the political parties will be able to spell out every single detail of their fiscal plans before an election, but we do need to be able to give a clear sense of the timescale for deficit reduction and from where the revenues will come or where savings will be made. And the parties should be able to indicate which budgets would be given greater or lesser priority, roughly how much should be saved from departmental expenditure and from the welfare budgets, and broadly how much, if at all, taxes should rise. And as Nick Clegg said on the MAR programme yesterday, the Liberal Democrats will be publishing plans setting out how we intend to deliver fiscal consolidation in a few weeks' time. But my party and I have already set out the tram lines for our approach, and these are as follows, and it's worth just sketching these out. Firstly, we believe, unlike the Conservative Party, that there must continue to be a contribution from taxation to fiscal consolidation. Without this, there would need to be very deep cuts in welfare spending in the next Parliament, cuts which have yet to be described by any party in British politics, and which would, in our view, lead to a very significant increase in poverty, including in-work poverty for those people on low incomes. Secondly, we believe, also unlike the Conservative Party, that once deficit reduction is completed in 2017-18, public spending is going to need to rise again and should rise again in real terms. Without this rise, coming after many years of austerity, we're likely to see a significant fall in the quality of public services, a decline which we don't think that the public would be willing to accept, not least in a growing, more affluent society where people do expect standards in areas such as education and health to improve over time. So we will need growing public spending after 2017-18 if we're to avoid, for example, a recruitment crisis in our schools and the National Health Service and a significant decline in service standards across most areas of the public sector, including in areas such as the armed forces and police, which are also sensitive areas, not just in the centre ground and on the left of the political agenda, but amongst parties of the right. Thirdly, our view is that we need to limit the number of spending pledges and other commitments which we make in our manifesto for the next Parliament, and carefully phase these over time to ensure that they're affordable. We won't make any tax or spending pledges in our manifesto which can't be afforded. We also share the IFG view that long-term planning periods for public spending are beneficial and that they lead to more efficiency and rational allocation of resources. And in this Parliament, we've obviously used a 3-year planning period for public spending, including in the first spending round that took place shortly after the general election. But of course, not all frontline public services actually benefit from this 3-year certainty. And it would, in my view, be helpful and beneficial not just to fund departments, but to fund frontline services for longer periods of time. And we should consider that. And of course, this government has already made a number of moves in that direction. In the DfE, we now set out our basic need capital budgets 3 years in advance rather than 1 year in advance. And in government, we've also moved to much longer term planning for major infrastructure expenditure, going out as far in some areas as 10 years. And that really is vitally important if there is to be some sort of stability for long-term infrastructure projects, of which we have a number now in the transport field, which really are projects that need to be delivered over long periods of time. And it's not just a question of holding a political consensus for those projects for long periods of time, it's also a matter of making sure they're funded properly. But I'm not convinced that moving to a 5-year spending review on all revenue and capital budgets would necessarily be achievable and deliverable. This is one of the recommendations in your report. Clearly, in principle, long-term budgeting is a good thing, but the problem is that 5 years really is quite a long term and a long time in economic terms. And setting all budgets that far ahead could be quite risky because many different assumptions would change over that period of time. Finally, as you've recommended, we do need to try to secure savings from fundamental redesign of public services rather than just applying salami slicing of budgets in each spending round and hoping that standards won't fall too much. And these savings will be larger and more politically acceptable if they're designed by those at the sharp end and not imposed simply from on high, one of the themes and recommendations in your paper. For example, there's almost certainly scope for significant savings from the police, from fire and ambulance services working more closely together across local authority boundaries and also across traditional service dividing lines. But this, in our view, should be driven by local decision making and facilitated by central government and not imposed on a top-down basis where often it's difficult to get public consensus for things that are seen to be driven by ministers from on high rather than from the interests of local services. My second area of focus is on how to make government itself more efficient and effective. And I should make clear that these are personal views. I don't think political parties necessarily have party policies on all of these matters, even the Liberal Democrats who like to have party policy on everything. And I must also acknowledge that my views in some of these areas probably derive a little bit from my unusual twin perspective as being a minister both in the DFE and in the Cabinet Office simultaneously. My first observation is that I'd say that government and its departments still have some way to go before management information is as clear and focused as it is in many parts of the private sector. And of course, in part, that's because the private sector is almost always much simpler than the government to make judgments about. Usually the objectives are much smaller. Usually there's something to do with profit, and it's usually easy to get agreement within the organisation on what those objectives are. All of those things are more challenging in government. There are many things that governments are trying to do, and the priorities tend to vary over time depending upon issues that come up or challenges that there are in service delivery. But for a government to be truly effective, as you point out in your report, there needs to be a manageable number of objectives. There needs to be some sort of consensus in government about what those objectives are, and those objectives need to be pursued relentlessly in order to make sure that amongst all the other things government has to do, ministers don't lose sight of what the real priorities are. And too many objectives can mean too little focus on those things that really matter. So there is an obligation on government to focus on and be very clear about the things that matter, and I actually think that improving our management information in government would help to do that. Secondly, I share your view expressed in the report that you published last year, that the centre of government can feel rather underpowered in relation to individual departments, although I suspect that this is a view more generally felt in the parts of the centre of government rather than in individual departments and by individual secretaries of state. And I do support your recommendation that there should be more central capacity to drive the government's policy agenda, reporting directly to the Prime Minister and, of course, in a coalition government to the Deputy Prime Minister. Of course, there is already some capacity of this kind, but much of this capacity, both in terms of ministerial time and civil service and advisor time, can be absorbed in dealing responsively with proposals from departments that constantly need to be vetted, and also in resolving cross-government disagreements, which, believe it or not, arise both in single-party governments as well as in coalitions, and also in dealing reactively with the latest emergency or crisis, which tend to come more frequently than one might expect. And what is needed, in my view, is a stronger proactive capability at the centre of government, including a long-term policy capability with an international perspective, so that we are fully up to date with what is happening in the cutting edge of policy in other countries, and we're looking not just at what's happening in the United Kingdom. And finally, there's an issue of advice and proactive policy support for ministers in individual departments. The media often report the activities of special advisors and civil service policy advisors as if these people add little to good government and spend all their time on media management. And sometimes politicians, particularly when they're in opposition, tend to play into that narrative when they ask questions about how many advisors there are and how much is being spent on them, which is usually not many advisors in comparison to the total size of the civil service and expenditure, which is still pretty tiny compared with the overall cost of government. All of the special advisors that I know in government, and obviously all of the Liberal Democrat advisors in particular, fulfill, in my view, a crucial role in giving ministers policy advice with a political dimension, a necessary political dimension, which is not something that it's easy for civil servants to provide because of the fact that they rightfully seek to stand back from party politics, something which I think is extremely valuable in our civil service and which I would not want to see change in the future. And while the overall quality of civil servants is generally very high, I've inserted very, particularly seeing the number of civil servants in the room, there is often a tendency to be reactive in policy terms in delivering solutions to known policy problems or ministerial requests without providing some of the proactive medium and long-term thinking which governments really need. And this is, of course, in part a function of the civil service not wanting to impose their policy views on ministers. But I suspect that in reality most ministers would like to see a more challenging and imaginative set of policy options than they sometimes receive. And the reality of government, I think, is not that there is a, generally speaking, a sort of secret civil service policy agenda that is being imposed the whole time on ministers. It is that, generally speaking, civil servants are respective of the different, respectful of the different position of ministers in driving policy and themselves as giving advice. And sometimes there, therefore, can be some gaps in the policy options that come forward. And special advisors and some of the new externally selected civil service policy advisors can provide this input and fill this very important gap. Finally, because I'm probably already in danger of breaching the 20-minute guideline, I wanted to turn briefly to the issue of effective coalition government. Now, in the past, some politicians and journalists have claimed that hung parliaments and coalitions would lead to chaos and uncertainty and weak government, and I think we heard all of those things, I seem to recall, from the Prime Minister and others before the May 2010 election. But the events of May 2010 right through to today prove that these predictions have been utterly wrong. This government was formed swiftly and efficiently. It's operated, I think, in an effective and an efficient manner. Relationships between both sides of the coalition have generally been good, even very good. The government has in many areas delivered quite a radical policy agenda, and the government is going to last its full 5-year term of office and will go on delivering fresh policy solutions in many areas right through to the end of the Parliament. And I would argue that this coalition government has been as effective as any single party government in my lifetime and has been considerably more effective than most single party governments in my lifetime. But there are, I think, some lessons to learn, and we should not assume that the future will automatically look like the past in relation to the challenges of managing and forming coalition governments. So my own reflections, and again these are personal reflections and not party positions, would be as follows. Firstly, in May 2010, the government was formed in just 5 days, as many of you will recall. And this was possible because of the favourable electoral arithmetic and the unstable economic background that put pressure on political parties to come to decisions quickly and to desire to bring the talks to a swift conclusion. And a large part of the detailed policy platform of the coalition was agreed, however, after the coalition was formed, which is something which has clear and obvious risks for the future. So my expectation is that in future, UK coalitions will take slightly longer to form. I think 48 hours or so longer than was the case in May 2010. This is because I expect slightly more detailed policy agreements than the agreement that was reached in May 2010. Less pressure, we all hope, from financial markets because we hope that we won't be forming a coalition in quite the same circumstances of an international crisis as we did in May 2010, something that people too easily forget today with the benefit of hindsight. And I think that there will also be a greater expectation of consultation amongst MPs in the other parties. That's not, I think, something that our party will contribute to because we already have a very high expectation of consultation, and we had a high level of consultation in 2010, and I don't think we'll need to add to that. But I think amongst the other parties, there will be less of a tolerance of what there tended to be in May 2010, which was a situation where the party leaders negotiated for their entire parties and then told the parties afterwards more or less what had been done. And I imagine, though I'm not the best person to comment upon Conservative Party and Labour Party internal management, that there will be a higher expectation of engagement by MPs in those other parties next time around. But in spite of that, the UK isn't Belgium, and it's not going to become Belgium, where they took an inordinate amount of time to form a coalition quite recently. In my view, our media and our public opinion will rightly not allow politicians to delay long before forming a government. A week is a long time in government, and I think it is long enough to form a government. My second point is this. Having been established, the coalition government has operated very effectively, as I said earlier. Some of this is frankly because the personalities within the government have been able to do business in a very civilised and efficient way. Not just the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister, but ministers working in individual departments, sometimes approaching their subjects from very different perspectives on the political agenda and on the political left-right spectrum. The most striking example of that is probably Ian Duncan Smith and Steve Webb, and the way they have, with their rather different political backgrounds and philosophies, managed to steer through really quite radical reform in the Department for Work and Pensions, most notably in the area of pensions policy. But it's also, I think, because the structures created in May 2010 and in the few months after May 2010 to hold a coalition government together have been very robust and very resilient, and actually rather better than some of the structures that were envisaged during the coalition talks, particularly between Nick Clegg and David Cameron. So, for example, the powerful Home Affairs Committee is chaired by Nick Clegg and gives my party a major lock on most key elements of domestic policy. But most significantly, the government's inner cabinet and key decision-making body is the so-called quad of 2 Conservative ministers and 2 Liberal Democrats. This and the placing of a Liberal Democrat in the key economic post of Chief Secretary to the Treasury has ensured that the Liberal Democrats are full partners in the coalition government and are active participants in taking all of the key decisions in government. And this has helped enormously, I think, to secure the government's unity and sense of purpose, because smaller parties in coalitions are going to feel disconnected and are not going to feel a sense of ownership if they're not party to all of those key decisions. But because of those mechanisms that we set up, it is very rarely, if ever the case, that we don't feel completely part of the decision-making process. And in my view, the key thing for any future coalition is that these mechanisms, which have served this coalition so well, should be preserved and built upon in the future. So I'm conscious, Tom, that I have covered a very large landscape in a very short period of time, and I hope that you will forgive me if I don't range across every part of the Lib Dem manifesto. Indeed, I'm sure some of you will be positively relieved if I don't. I welcome the fact that the Institute for Government has published this report into effective government, which is timely, which is going to evolve over the next few weeks, all of the political parties. And your report prompts us at an important time to reflect on what we now need to do in the future to achieve that goal of more effective government, which is something that we all have a strong interest in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that very wide-ranging speech. I'm personally very much looking forward to the lecture series that you're going to be doing here on effective government over 5 or 6 events next year. So I will actually open straight to the floor for some questions, and knowing where my paycheck comes from, I will go to the back of the room and go to Peter Riddell first, and then can we have a couple of others at the same time? And ideally, can you say who you are and where you come from before you go? And I'll take another one right at the back there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Doc. David, thank you very much for your remarks about the Institute at the beginning of your talk. Could I take on from one of the themes you raised, looking at the future spending review and so on? A lot of the problems are, of course, cross-departmental ones. And one of the analyses we have here, if you're going to achieve savings, you've got to achieve them, as you referred to, on a cross-departmental basis. Is the current machinery adequate for doing that? We've seen experiments on a slightly different way of having ministers across departments, but do we require a different way of doing spending reviews and a different way of operating to look at policy issues? Classic at present is social care and health, which crosses departments, but there are a number of others, some involved in the education area, and employment, which require a different way of approaching government.
Thanks very much. Alan Lehman from the Management Consultancies Association. David, I'd be interested to know two questions. One is whether you, on having had the experience of fixed-term parliaments, now see the benefits of fixed-term parliaments in terms of effective government and therefore would argue to keep them, and whether you have a view on the 5 versus 4 years point. And related to that, you got into the details of how you form coalitions. Suppose you get into a position where actually you don't get a coalition but you get a minority government, or somebody attempting to have a minority government in a fixed-term parliament. Is this, in your view, is that just so beyond imagining in terms of effective government that we shouldn't contemplate it, or could you imagine circumstances in which it would work effectively?
Very good. Do you want to have a crack at those three?
Yes. Are you okay for me to do this?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, on Peter's question, I think you're absolutely right that in terms of getting value for money, but also joining up some services where there are clearly challenges across departments, and a very topical one would be the National Health Service and social care that you mentioned. We do need the ability to see some of those connections, both to improve public services and to deliver savings. Some of that, of course, is already being brokered somewhat by the Treasury, and it's no secret, I think, that Danny has been extremely supportive of initiatives like the Troubled Families Initiative, which is a cross-departmental initiative which has been funded, I think, by different departments, and which he is passionate about, not only because he thinks it's a way of tackling some of those troubled families, but also because he can see the potential for joining up work being done by different people and avoiding duplication, something which has been echoed to me from the ground upwards, that actually at the moment there are all sorts of different services that see the same families, and it's possible to both save money and deliver a better outcome by joining some of those things up. I suppose the question is, do you need a different vehicle for doing that? And there are risks with cross-departmental working as well, that you can spend an awful lot of time talking to each other and not making any decisions. I suppose there are some ways of delivering the gains that you're talking about by machinery of government changes, although I think Prime Ministers rightly these days make machinery of government changes sparingly and hopefully with a high threshold in terms of them being justified in terms of greater productivity. I think the Treasury can probably do quite a lot of brokering in this area, but certainly I think any future government in delivering savings ought to be looking at these opportunities to drive real efficiency savings rather than just salami slicing individual departments. And a government has to think about whether it's able to capitalise on those savings that require cooperation across departments. And if the Treasury can't broker that, then there may need to be some formal or informal mechanisms for seeing and exploiting those opportunities. On Alan's point about fixed-term parliaments, I mean, I think it's a topical issue because I think actually at the end of DFE oral questions today, some Conservative backbencher was moving a private member's bill to, which was called something like the termination of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. And there are lots of people now saying, oh, what a terrible idea this is, and we need to unravel it. I really don't understand the thinking of that at all. I mean, every other set of elections that we have in this country, there is a fixed arrangement. You know when the elections are going to be. You don't have the nonsense of politicians picking election dates for their own self-interest. You don't have the uncertainties that potentially paralyse government when people don't know when the election is going to be, which, as we saw from the last, Gordon Brown Parliament, is uncertainty that can go on for long periods of time and very early in the Parliament. And I see nothing good about the system that we've moved away from. And although we did debate in the talks whether there should be 4-year fixed-term parliaments or 5-year fixed-term parliaments, I actually think that 5 years on balance is a more sensible period of time, not least because there is always a risk, and actually I don't think it's really happened with this government in the way that many people thought it would, but there is a real risk that after you go over the period of time when there is only 1 year to go of the Parliament, that people start to sort of become less ambitious about policy making. And that's going to happen at some point in a parliament, whether it's a 4-year parliament, a 7-year parliament, or a 5-year parliament. And the risk is, if you've got a 4-year parliament, people start to switch off after 3 years, which is not an awfully long time to make big reforms and to have big ideas. So I think it's hugely in the country's interest to have fixed-term parliaments, and I think 5 years is a very sensible period of time. And of course, while we didn't have fixed parliaments before, we had 5-year parliaments, and that there was an expectation that parliaments could go the full 5-year term, and quite a few of them did. And on the Alan's second point about minority governments and whether we could have a party that was presumably the largest party and chose simply to go by itself, I think that that's quite possible. And our party took the strong view in 2010 that taking responsibility for a government being in power, but doing so from the opposition benches without your hands on the levers of power, was not a very attractive place to be, because you take all the responsibility for the party that's in power being in power, but you actually don't have very much influence. But firstly, you can't get into a negotiating position where you say, as the smaller party, if that's what we are, that you're going to be determined to be in government come what may, because you would then have a very strong negotiating position. And it's always, of course, quite possible that another party will literally say, sorry, we're not interested in talking to you. We're going to pursue our own agenda, and we're going to see if we can secure a majority in Parliament. But the risk clearly is that such a government would be very unstable and would not be able to secure a very bold mandate. So that is a possible outcome, either because we can't get an agreement or because another party takes that view. But I don't think it's a very attractive outcome for any party, and I don't think it's certainly not a very attractive outcome for the country, that parties shouldn't try to get a proper government with a strong mandate and majority.
Very good. Any more questions? I will also encourage ladies to come forward with questions as well. Let's go 1, 2, and then we'll go. Let's do 2 at a time, actually. I think 2's fine.
Peter Tomlinson. I'm not a civil servant. I am the son of a reluctant one who was dragged in during the war. Michael Heseltine produced a report in which he pointed out lack of skills in a certain government department. And skills problems with civil servants is what I've detected on numerous occasions over the years. There is a start of a program for training for upskilling, but I'm very puzzled as to why it has not seriously gone ahead, and why it does not deal with a situation where a civil servant has to work with a special advisor but doesn't have the skills to properly work with that special advisor. Are we going to see a much wider program of upskilling in the next Parliament?
James Sandbach from the Law Commission and Legal Action Group. Picking up your question, your answer to the question to Peter Whittle on redesigning public services and departmental collaboration on how services are delivered. I mean, you're probably aware of sort of John Seddon's systems thinking work in public administration and some of the basic kind of concepts behind that. Do you accept the sort of case that systems thinking people sometimes make, that there may be a case sometimes to spend more money on some front end type services in order to save money on the back end of those services? The back end of those services being when they go wrong, and where maladministration creeps in, and where they actually don't solve people's problems. So people go from sort of one provider to another, trying to get things sorted out. And there's been a lot of work piloting local authorities, and some local authorities have come up with an interesting system thinking answers. They're not necessarily kind of there's no sort of off the peg solution here. But is that a concept that's possible to embed more in central government thinking?
Yes, I mean, to take the second point first, I think it is possible to embed more of that thinking, but I think it's also right that we should test that type of thinking against fairly rigorous standards, because it's too easy sometimes to justify expenditure on the basis of hope rather than the reality. So I think provided you can test it in a rigorous way, it's fine to do so, and so there will be some cases where it makes sense to do as you're suggesting. On Peter's point about upskilling civil servants, my general experience of civil servants, admittedly I've only been in a couple of departments in government, and I would say this even if they weren't in the room, is that the general standard of civil servants is actually very high. Of course, as in any organisation with large numbers of people, it's going to be variable. You don't find any group of people, including politicians, where everybody is brilliant. There is a normal distribution to these things. But I think the standards of civil servants, the job that they do is extremely good. And sometimes it's assumed that the private sector is always way better than civil service and more disciplined and more efficient and better managed. And I can tell you I've operated in some private sector organisations that are very incompetently and badly run, and that could have dealt with and benefited from some of the efficiency I've seen within the civil service. So I don't know whether there is an upskilling process. I'm sure you're right to take the view that the civil service should always be looking at itself and challenging its quality and looking at how to improve. But my point more was that I'm concerned that one of the disbenefits of having a depoliticised civil service, which I think is extremely valuable to the country and which I would want very passionately to keep, is that sometimes civil servants don't feel that they have got the green light to think ambitiously outside the box on policy issues. Sometimes I think that they feel that they need to think in terms of reaction to problems, or they need to have guidance from ministers and others. And sometimes it is easy for policy advisors and special advisors, knowing the mind of their ministers and politicians, to understand where there is an appetite for more ambitious policy thinking and to be able to take that on without there being political sensitivities. And I'm not sure that the answer is to greatly politicise the civil service. I think it is to acknowledge that actually these people who are policy advisors and special advisors who come in from the outside and who are usually rubbished in the media and the lots of stories about how much this government's spending versus the last one, and we all contribute to it in opposition. I think actually we ought to see that those individuals play a very important role almost always, and that most of them are focused on actually quite serious policy matters, and fusing their expertise and their knowledge with civil servants' expertise and non-political approach is probably the way to get the right overall mix of these two very important qualities.
I'll just abuse my position from a chair for the second. And there's a real question, I think, now as you go into the election, of course, what you think the civil service should be doing to prepare for a 2015 government internally, both in terms of preparing for a as yet not visible to the electorate policy agenda and thinking about how it gets itself ready to deliver for whatever composition of government is coming through, and in terms perhaps of thinking about some of those questions about how you engage with a new agenda, potentially a radical one, depending on your Secretary of State in charge. So what sort of preparation do you think you want to see, and what are you encouraging within your department, and do you think should be happening across Whitehall more generally?
Well, I think what will be going on, and obviously we're not allowed to see all that's going on because it's thinking that is based upon different scenarios for the election and not just the Liberal Democrats sweeping back into power. But what I think is going on and what should be going on is firstly civil servants should be looking at the policy offers that are coming forward from the political parties and saying, if we end up having to serve a government of this particular complexion, how would we deliver their policies quickly and efficiently and give good policy advice? I'm pretty sure that'll be happening, and it was certainly my experience from the period of time that I had in 2010 in government that actually the civil service was extremely well prepared for the policy challenges that the different political parties were going to come forward with. I think also the civil service will be planning, or ought to be planning, for the possible scenarios that will arise if a coalition is being negotiated, and they'll want to be able to give whatever policy advice is sought by the political parties to inform that process of coalition talks. My own personal view is that the process in May 2010, however, where we locked Gus O'Donnell and others outside the door rather than inviting the civil service inside the door for the negotiations, is better than involving the civil service in the negotiation process itself, which is actually what happened in Scotland in 1999 when the first coalition was formed there. The civil servants were very actively involved in the coalition forming process. But I think that's difficult because A, it can be difficult for the civil service, in spite of its professionalism, to maintain complete independence and perception of independence when it's drawn into advising different political parties in a negotiation, particularly when there's an asymmetry in size between the parties. And also I suspect that on the whole, most politicians can probably cut to the chase more quickly and have slightly more candid, productive arguments when they don't feel they're being minuted or recorded by civil servants than when they feel that that everything is being done in a more public way. And I remember, I think it was William Hague in May 2010 joking when we locked Gus O'Donnell outside the door. Well, I'm not sure we actually locked him, but said that we didn't need him. I remember William Hague saying, at least joking, that at least now we wouldn't need to worry about freedom of information requests coming in about what we were discussing. And sure enough, on the very last day of the coalition talks, on the Tuesday following us starting on the Friday, the civil service received the first freedom of information request from some industrious journalists asking for the minutes of all our coalition talks. And we were able to say quite honestly that there were no government minutes of those meetings anyway. So I would really want to repeat the way in which the civil service engaged with ministers in 2010, because I think it was both successful and the right model.
Very good. Oh, now we've got some questions. Okay, Josie, then we'll run across there and then there.
Josie Clough, Morehouse Consulting. I was interested in what you were saying about the delivery capability of government. And public sector major programmes get quite a bad press. And I wondered, A, whether you thought that was fair, and B, what you think we could do to improve them.
Thanks. Akash Pound from the Institute for Government. I just wanted to pick up on the points about effective coalition management. You referred to the importance of having the Deputy Prime Minister in the central machinery, of course, on the Quad, the relationship between him and the Prime Minister, their joint oversight of some of the central policy capacity and so on. But there is, of course, a school of thought that questions whether, at least in a second coalition, the DPM would or should be based in the centre and in the same kind of role as he took in 2010. I mean, certainly the political constitutional reform portfolio probably won't exist in the same way. So I just wonder what you think of that debate, and whether, if Nick Clegg or someone else were again DPM, should he take a very different kind of job heading a big policy department or something like that, which is what people in the equivalent position in many European coalitions would do.
Very good. Just take those two actually, David, and then we'll...
Yeah, on the second one, it's a bit beyond my pay grade to determine what Nick should or shouldn't be doing if we were in coalition. And you're quite right to say that is sort of a genuinely interesting issue for parties in our position in a coalition, and I don't think there is one sort of perfect answer. The only observation I would make, and this isn't necessarily to lead you in one direction or another, because I would like to sit on the fence on the basic question that you're asking, is that what I think is essential is that whatever the Deputy Prime Minister is and isn't doing, and whether he or she in a future government has a big portfolio of his or her own, the experience of this government is that they still need to be able to apply quite a lot of their time to managing cross-government issues. There are quite a few things which ultimately can only be decided by the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, either because there are big disagreements or because there are major foreign policy or other challenges which just have to go to that level in the government. And I can imagine, for example, I don't want to rule Nick out inadvertently for any position, but if you are spending large amounts of time not in the country or something, it would be quite challenging, because in reality in a coalition, that job that the Deputy Prime Minister is doing at the centre of government really is important. And a huge amount of it the public and even the media never see, but there's a huge ongoing dialogue every day, both through private offices and often in very direct ways, which is necessary for running a coalition well. And on the major programmes issue, I mean, I've seen a huge number of programmes in government and very big, bold projects which people have forecast would be delivery catastrophes and impossible to do, where the civil service has been absolutely brilliant in managing enormous policy challenges. And sometimes the civil service is at its best in delivering massive programmes with all sorts of bits where you need a lot of quality control and a lot of focus and a lot of downright solid management. I think where governments have sometimes come to grief in the past is particularly over IT-related projects, where there hasn't always been, there's a lot of evidence that government has struggled in those areas with very large IT projects. Of course, there's probably also quite a lot of evidence that the private sector has struggled with IT projects, and I don't know whether there's any comparative analysis to say whether governments are significantly worse than the private sector. But I would be inclined to say that is a challenge that we need to address more effectively in the future. I wouldn't like to say whether the reforms that Francis Maude and others have already made in this area, which are supposed to be addressing these, how far they've already gone in driving more efficient use of the private sector and others to manage those types of big projects. But certainly that has been an issue in the past.
A few more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap up. So prepare your final remarks, David, as well as your answers to these. I'm going to go for 1, 2, 3 questions.
Hi, it's Katie King from the Behavioural Insights team. I was just wondering if you felt, or your opinion on whether the process of writing a manifesto has changed, whether because there's greater expectation that there could be a coalition, whether people are matching policies or drawing more lines underneath things that are non-negotiables. So I was just wondering whether you feel like things have changed this year, and whether perhaps there's less diversity in the manifestos because of that.
Hi, Robbie Coleman from the Education Endowment Foundation. I wondered if you had any thoughts about whether the ways in which decisions are made, the factors which affect policy decisions in coalition government compared to single-party government, are likely to be different. So, for instance, might evidence play a greater role in coalition government compared to single-party government?
I'm Andrew Gray. I'm Professor in Public Management from that desolate part of the UK called the North East. Let me put some cases to you which I picked up in research and ask you which is the more effective government. A elderly couple living together with different conditions. The man is treated by the NHS for oncology, for cancer, and his social care is provided by the county council directly. 2 ladies turn up every day, make sure he's clean and tidied. They have to turn up as a pair because he might be needed to be lifted, but they always make sure when they leave that his wife, who has dementia, is also okay, although she's not their client. She's dealt with by a private company under contract to the county council providing dementia social care. They turn up in ones, usually unqualified, although they're meant to be dementia registered. They fill in a log in the house which says what they have done, and on many occasions, and I was called in to investigate this on behalf of a PCT, they left the husband in his own mess. But they ticked all the boxes and they delivered the care on time, on spec, within budget. Which of those 2 delivery systems is the more effective government?
So questions and one highly rhetorical one.
Yes, the last one sounded like a leading question. I'm not sure whether whether the point I'm genuinely not sure, so do feel free to interrupt, but I'm not sure whether the point you're making was the one about the quality experience between those two providers, or whether you were making a wider point, which is where I thought you were going with the argument, that actually there is still too little joining up of NHS and social care delivery, which I certainly think is the case. I mean, this government has tried to go a lot further down that track, but I think there is a lot further to go, and that's something that that Jeremy Hunt and Eric Pickles are exploring very actively with the Treasury, and I think it will be an issue for all of the parties in the next Parliament. On the EEF point about the role of evidence in single-party governments versus coalitions, yes, I do think actually, as you will probably expect me to say, that evidence plays a more important part in coalition governments, and that's not just because I'm a Liberal Democrat and I have to persuade everybody that coalitions are always better, but genuinely I think you are going to have more debates and more even-handed debates in a coalition government, because if you're in a single-party government, whoever is at the top of the tree in a department or whoever is the lead Secretary of State is generally speaking going to get their own way when they have a strong view about some issue. In a coalition government, there are many sources of challenge and testing of arguments, because the coalition ministers within a department can challenge something even that the Secretary of State is wanting to do with the backup of the Deputy Prime Minister or of the Prime Minister if it's the other way around. There are processes of agreement through the Home Affairs Committee which are much more challenging than they would be in a single-party government, where I think, generally speaking, ministers wouldn't dare try to veto things from other ministers in the same party. So I think there is a lot more testing of arguments, and I can remember lots of arguments I've had with other Conservatives in government where we've sort of ended up testing arguments which are more rigorously tested in a coalition because there's a greater equality of ability to have disputes, and where obviously sometimes there will be a deep-seated party view on some issue, but quite often there isn't actually, and you'll be led by having an intelligent debate about the issues and the evidence. So I think that is potentially one of the benefits that coalition governments can bring. And on Katie's point, I think it was about whether coalition, the era of coalition, brings more sort of desiccated manifestos where everybody is desperately trying to find attempts to agree with each other. I really don't think that that is the case, and I certainly, even as a Liberal Democrat who believes in coalition government and wants to see our policies delivered in government, I think it would be deadly and depressing if we ended up with a sort of fight over small differences. And I think the nature of politics is that there tends to be a competition and parties want to differentiate their wares. And I don't really see any signs in this coming general election that everybody is competing desperately for the middle ground. We've got some big differences over things like Europe. We've got some big differences across the parties on economic policies. We've got a very big difference on fiscal policy between parties, arguably a bigger difference than we've seen for many general elections. So I think the natural tendencies in politics are that parties like to differentiate their wares. Clearly, I think that there will be more thinking behind the scenes amongst parties about preparation for hung parliaments than there was in the past, but I don't think that will mean taking out anything divisive from manifestos. And I think that political parties will have to think, all political parties, not just the Lib Dems, about what they say about priority and non-priority and red line issues. And that isn't while clearly parties need to be really thoughtful about what they say they can and can't deliver, that is not as easy as just saying, here are our red lines and let's be very clear and transparent about it. Because as soon as you as a political party say, here are our red lines, nothing else, by the way, in our manifesto should be considered a red line, you've given away your entire negotiating position and sold yourself down the river. And your negotiating position ought to be determined by the outcome of the election and how much political support you've got, not by the decisions you make about red lines way in advance of the election. So that's going to be a tricky issue for all the political parties, but it isn't one I think that leads automatically to a narrowing of the political spectrum.
Thank you very much, David. I won't keep you too much longer, but I will give you a chance to come back with any sort of final thoughts if you want. I mean, there's sort of a big theme going through our programme for effective government, which I think came out a bit in some of the questions, which is around the sort of sense that we are in search of a new politics as well as a new type of politics, and that's reflected obviously in rising support for various different parties, but the fragmentation of the two main parties in particular, changes in the nation, in the way in which we have power spread across the country, both in terms of Liberal Democrats as a localist party thinking about power going to local authorities and local areas, and in terms of the big debates that are coming up around devolution to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and then the big Europe question you mentioned before. So as we look to 2015, I wondered if you had anything to say about what you think really are going to be the big sort of seismic, big picture shifts that people will remember for a long time, and how you think government should sort of respond to those. So with these big changes in the way that UK government actually works, you've talked about coalition, but what about this wider change in the sort of almost in the constitution of the UK, and how important do you think that is, and how do you think you should shape your response to it, and any final other points you want?
Well, I mean, one of the things we haven't debated in detail today, but it is a massive issue for the 2015 election, is the whole constitutional future of the UK. There's a lot of change that we've put in motion over the last few parliaments in terms of Scottish devolution and Welsh devolution and devolution in England, and that revolution really in the way that the country is run hasn't yet finished, and changes that we make in one area don't necessarily bring all of the change to a conclusion. They tend, for the time being, to set in train new pressures for further change and for correcting anomalies that can arise in the process of change. So I think there's a very big issue around the way in which the UK operates, which we need to deal with in the next Parliament. Clearly, you'll have seen from the command paper that the government published recently that that's an issue not just for Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, but increasingly for England and the way we make decisions in England as well. And there is, of course, the whole issue of Britain's role within the European Union, which is going to be very live in the next Parliament. But I would just finish with largely some very, very brief optimistic thoughts that we have shown over the last 5 years how coalition governments can operate very effectively. We've shown that how they can not only be coherent processes of government in which decisions are made, in which people wake up each morning and don't listen to the radio with a sense of fear and chaos about where the next decision is going to be made. I think there are also, as some of the questioners have hinted at, some advantages in government through having coalitions, and I think that the ability to test arguments and to test evidence is actually greater in a coalition government. I think that parties do have a lot to learn from each other sometimes in policy areas, and you get the forced benefit of that in coalition. And also I think we have learnt in this Parliament what mechanisms work well in running coalition governments, and in particular, which I think party leaders are likely to pay note of in the future, whoever they are. If you want a stable, coherent coalition, most party leaders as well as smaller parties do, then you have to have mechanisms of getting agreement on things in which both parties feel that they have a complete buy-in. Because if you don't have those mechanisms, like the Home Affairs Committee and the Quad and the presence of Danny Alexander in the Treasury, then you don't get that sense of joint ownership, and therefore it's more difficult to hold governments together. But lest we put the Institute for Government out of business by being overly optimistic about the future and the simplicity of all of this, I'll finish by simply saying that the challenges of the past and May 2010 aren't necessarily going to be, and the way in which those were dealt with won't necessarily be the same in May 2015 or in May 2020. There will be different challenges, and no politicians, particularly if there is a hung parliament, should be complacent about the process that leads ultimately to a stable government for the country.
Thank you very much. If we can thank David in the usual way.